Welcome everyone to Intermediate Selfology with yours truly, your philosopher at large, Tristan McGough. And today we are going to take a deeper dive into what we discussed last time in terms of identity and identification. And today we're considering agency is identifying consciousness. And the agent actually is the agent of a process and a plan, purpose, progress, and perfection. Yes, there are reasons why we're here. There are powers to unfold. There are experiences that we flower in as we move throughout our lives. It's not just a matter of suffering. It's also a matter of purpose. Because purpose has to do, first of all, with taking what is potential as being and turning it into something which is existentially viable and has actuality. So the movement from potential to the actual is actually a process. However, when one looks at that process and what you are taking are various potentials or essences and reifying them, that is, turning them into actualities, into things that exist at some level of your being, whether it's physically or emotionally or mentally or some higher levels. They all do exist. But all of it itself is the actualization of being. And this is why, in terms of looking at conscious being, consciousness is not just a vapor or an abstraction. Consciousness has being. It has being as identity, will, mind, love, and life. These are all the essential bases or hypostases of consciousness, these five. And along the axis of identity, it doesn't matter what plane our consciousness enters, we always have that sense of identity. In terms of the 7 intuitional ideas of self, today we're going to take, as I said, a closer analytic look at what we had spoken of before in terms of what goes into the cognography of consciousness. And in terms of mapping consciousness out, all of these various potentials and powers, faculties, capabilities, capacities, and functions, I've itemized in terms of identity and identification by way of a chart. So that we have here the 7 levels of ousia, or of being. The physical, the emotive, the mentive, the egoic, the intuitive, the cognal, and the eanu, the one. And there is a reason, or a purpose, if you will, which when ourselves, our senses of identity are fulfilled on any given plane, it manifests in a certain form of life. Again, back to process. The process of taking what is potential and making actual, what is an essence, and turning it into an existence. All of that can be guided, and that's a plan. It's choosing what essences and what potentials to manifest at what time, where, and when. That is part of what self-mastery is. So just on the physical plane, where we're looking at the individual as basically a set of basic needs for sustenance and survival, food and shelter from the elements, as well as the safety needs of security and freedom from interference and harm. We look on the physical level, and when the purposes of the identity is fulfilled on that plane, it leads to what is called the sufficient life. The identity as an I-it, remember, an embedded subject within an objective body, a body which is an object that is an inter-object. It's not by itself. The body exists in the context of the environment. The body itself is composed of the various elements that go to compose all the other things within the physical environment. When the basic needs of the body are met, the identity inside has what is called the sufficient life. And that is its purpose. When it has all of its safety and security needs met, it has the secure life. The sufficient life and the secure life are the fulfillment of the purposes of identity on the physical plane through the I-it relation. The I-it. The I, let us understand, when we speak of the I, and then there's the I am, as we go back to our original chart here, we speak of the I along this axis of identity, and then you add to it the I am, the I thou, the I me. The greater includes the lesser, so that I, as consciousness, always include whatever my being is at this level of universality, where I participate as consciousness within the universal whole at this very high level of spiritual existence. And spiritual means consciousness. So at this very high level of the existence of awareness. I, thou is enfolded in the I am. It is a special way of apprehending the preciousness of being, whether it's actual being as power, whether it's being as beauty or truth or goodness. As we move down, there seems to be a narrowing or a constricting of what the I is interacting with at that appropriate plane of being, and surely that's so. So that by the time we hit the physical plane, our impact in the world is very small, localized, and solidified. It is much more expansive on the emotive plane, even more so on the meditative plane, even more so in the kingdom of God of your mind as a subjective being, as a psyche, as a soul. The parameters that you can reach in terms of the inner me are fantastic. And as we move into the transpersonal realm, the influence and the identification of what you are proceeds to become ever more expansive. So that eventually one understands that at every one of the levels of being there is an appropriate life, which is the fulfillment of identity's purpose. So in the same way that you had, then you'll recognize Maslow's important contribution in terms of identifying these needs that we have on this physical plane being met because the higher levels of energy permeate and prevail over the lesser. So that, just take the physical world. This page is composed of molecules, which are composed of atoms. which are composed of quanta. Keep going deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper and deeper. There are other levels of what constitutes the energy of this page. Think of dark matter, think of dark energy. When it comes to meeting the social needs, which is that sense of belongingness, rootedness within a family or within the community itself, then you have a friendly life. That's the fulfillment of identity through the I, us. You have a friendly life. And so it moves up, so that when it comes to the level of basic self-esteem, respect from your peers and your family and your friends, then you have a confident life. And the fulfillment of the identity takes place between I and the other, where the other has reflected back through respect, and where you reflect back on your own self with a certain degree of pride in the good sense, and you have self-esteem. That's the confident life. On the level of I, me, where's the level of actualization and self-actualization. That's the point at which it's the point at which literally you as the point of consciousness begin to consciously pivot to the world around you. You no longer are in the thralls of reaction. You begin to respond to the various things that occur not only in your outer life, but in your inner life, so that when thoughts and feelings, etc., arise, you deal with them in a more adept way. When that occurs, then you have an actualized life. Or we might call it an actualizing life, because you eventually find that the conscious unfoldment of your potentials can be planned. There are better things that you can do that create the causal conditions for a virtuous fruit, that is a fruit that leads to your fulfillment as a self-conscious being. So that's the actualizing life. And in the same way, we can look at the other, and the authentic life is when you live by truth. The happy life is when you live by love, and the complete life is when you live by goodness. And all of these various forms of life means that identity is fulfilling itself through its identification with various elements of its appropriate plane by these various powers, these faculties, which of course is just a distillation of this. All right. So when we look at this, we're understanding that this is the axis we've called of ipsitas, or identity. And here I'm representing that as the axial self, and that's an important concept because what you're really talking about is looking at the seven planes and then saying where consciousness takes a focal stance, and that's all it's doing. When we're talking about the empirical ego, the mortal self, which basically is the physical body, the emotional body, and your mental body, plus your empirical self or personality in terms of your egoic plane, it anchors itself appropriately so that everything that occurs as a finite experience. That's the purpose of the empiric self. It is a focal setting of consciousness, a lens, an eye of finity. It breaks everything up into sortals. There are sections or segments, right? There are visual sections you have. That's all that you've got. You break it down into subsections, but there are sections, and all of those are put together in a certain scenario or scene. They don't just happen disorganized or move without causal condition. And everything that you experience as consciousness has a span, a certain duration, and the arising and subsisting and abiding and perishing of every cognizance you have, of every state of consciousness, is seen as part of a series. So we segment the world, we sortalize it according to series and spans and sections and scenes. And all these things together, we put together as stories of our existence. The transcendental ego, which is often called the immortal self within literature and art and religion, has to do with the upper end of the egoic plane, that the epistemic relation of subject-object, of I, me, holds sway. That is a transfinite realm. Transfinity is where all the items that have been finitized and experienced are retained as the experienced. They're always accessible. And all the powers that you have as a psychical being, a solar being there at this level of the transcendental ego, all of these faculties protend into the future. None of them just sit still. They are always actively engaged in dynamically unfolding some part of their presence. And this can be done willy-nilly, or this can be done by plan. And we find that in terms of the transcendent ego that trends it all, the imperishable self, the self that is part of the universality of spirit or of consciousness. At that point, at the cogno level, it embraces both egos, both the finite empirical ego and the transfinite ego. How? Well, infinity. The infinity of infinities holds every infinity. The infinity of even numbers is held within the greater infinity of whole numbers, or better yet, natural numbers. And so it goes. So every transfinity that is of every single soul is nothing more than a slice, if you will, of infinity. When we're talking about the I and its axes, we're talking about the I as it exists as a twofold entity, as the actor-watcher. That's its axial agency. In other words, at the top of everything is the indivisible self, the trigonic self, the apexal self. That's the self whose identity is the same on every single plane. You don't have a different identity when you experience emotions than when you experience thoughts on the mental plane, or when you perform on the physical plane. It isn't that all of a sudden you have a different identity. You have the very same who. You're the very same who. You are the identity that identifies through these various essentialities, if you will, of approaching and participating with any given plane. So when we're talking about agency, we're talking about the actor and the watcher. And with the actor, at the same time that the actor originates, the watcher is illuminating. That is, it knows. It witnesses immediately. We talk about this apperceptive ability of the agent, and this is exactly it. At the very moment that consciousness is acting as consciousness as a process of cognition, at that very moment, it's self-illumined, it knows. In the same way that when we, as a soul or as a psyche, we mentate, we have an idea, we can reflect on that. Whatever we are mentating, whatever we are feeling, whatever, that's what I mean by a mentation. It can be a feeling, a willing, whatever occurring at the psychical level, the level of your inner subjective consciousness. Any of that is reflectable. You can reflect on any of it. It's there, it's happening at that moment. And in the same way that when you are down here in the empirical realm, in the finite realm, and you act as an observer, you are also performing. Because before I could observe over there, I had to preform, I had to throw my head in that direction so that my eyes could see. Your performance and your observation are absolutely interdependent on the empirical plane, in the same way that when you're thinking or mentating, I meant thinking in the wider sense there, but when you're mentating and reflecting, those are companion parts to the agent, because the agent is not only watching, the agent is also acting. And that's why I say that when it comes to agency, that's the identifying consciousness. That's Ipsiatus. That's the very top of the pyramid. No matter what part of the pyramid you're looking at, it all emerges from identity, from Ipsiatus, from the I. From who? From conscious being. Agency is consciousness. And I want to take a tour of that agency as identifying consciousness from the bottom up. Let's begin right here on the physical, I, it. There we have a split that takes place in terms of the co-emergent, the way that identity dually apprehends, bifurcates its attention immediately. And on the physical plane, there's the bodily it, and there's the environmental it. And they are interobjective. So the I, it on the physical plane has to do where I see my it in the world. That's my body. And I see all the other its in the world, and that's their bodies. And that's the interobjective realm of the I, it on the physical plane. When we move to the emotive plane, I'm using Bertrand Russell's language here. There are the acquaintive and the descriptive us's. When I identify with a social grouping, if that grouping is one that I am personally acquainted with, I know them directly. That's the kind of knowledge by acquaintance Bertrand Russell speaks of, and that's exactly what I'm meaning here in terms of an acquaintive us. A descriptive us, on the other hand, is I might belong to a political party or a particular denomination, and I define myself and my membership to that group according to what I describe as either our shared beliefs or our common ethnicity or our history or our geography or however else I want to describe what it is that creates the bond amongst us. And so at that point, on this level, I don't see myself as just a body. I see myself as feelings and as relationships, as bonds, particularly with my family and friends and other intimates. And on the wider scenario, I see myself as sharing that with others in a wider social context, which is non-organic or social, and which we know through description. When it comes to the mental plane and the I, other, that turns into two things. That turns into categories, that is, abstract concepts, or into membership sets in which they are classes. You take finite concrete things and group them together into a set or a class of objects, like a class of all the papers I could shuffle up together. And those are finite objects. But when it comes to the abstract, there is no finite object, it's a transfinite object, and I'm referring to, for instance, if I define paper in a certain way, and I say this is cardstock, which includes being a type of paper, and we would all understand that because we fold these higher level concepts or categories into one another. Okay. So that has to do with the I other. When it comes to the I me, the division that takes place we've already talked about. There is the epistemic relationship that divides us, that divides me from myself, I and me. I have these thoughts, I have these feelings. Somebody asks to describe it, well, who are you and what are you? You look at yourself and you say, well, I'm this. And what you really are is all the me that you're projecting on your inner screen of consciousness and you're reflecting. That's you. The I is what's generating that thought at that moment, that feeling at that moment. And the composite of those you throw together and you call a me. Well, that me ends up becoming the personality, and that's the empirical. That's the empirical ego. And the other is the epistemic ego. The epistemic ego is always realizing that it is generating its noia, its contents, its thoughts, and it can enjoy those, etc. However, when it bundles those together as finite things and say, well, I'm this particular kind of individual, I have these attributes, those are all finite things. That bundle is called the personality, and that can be mistaken as something that has a kind of concrete reality, which is beyond what it really is. It's a mortal self. It will always change, and that will die. However, the epistemic ego, that is the immortal self that keeps generating conscious experiences transfinitely as long as the ego participates within samsara, that is, the cyclic causality of a given universe. So that's the I me that divides into the epistemic and empirical egos. And then there's the I thou, and the I thou divides into the transcendent, which is Godhead, right? That's where you see yourself as part of that. I am that, Tataramasi. You see yourself as part of the divine whole. And then there's the other where you see yourself as this individual who has this consciousness and this stream of awareness along this axis of identity. So, but there's a covariancy to both of those. They arise at the same time. You don't have a transcendent I thou, a transcendent thou, without a immanent thou. And then when it comes to the I am, that is, I describe that as I am that, or as deity, doios, and I am all that. And that is the unit, or I am all this. this, meaning something particular from the that, being taken and being individualized in the I am. When we look at the axis of identity and we split it right down and we just leave the I, that's pure identity. The others are the way that that I interacts with being to unfold itself, which of course is unfolding the greater being, of which all the beings are participating in. So, we understand at this point that in order for the axis of an individual's identity to expand, it does so through the I am, the I thou, the I me, the I thother, the I us, and the I it. And these are all the way that it approaches being as the medium through which all other sentient beings are doing the exact same. Consciousness is reaching out to consciousness through its own medium and mechanism. So when we talk about consciousness itself and we move up to the infinite complete consciousness of I, we have to understand that that is what we mean by the source. If you will, that is the I, E-Y-E, through which the paraverse enters into our universe. Because remember, the greater energy always enfolds the lesser. It isn't as if the paraverse is somewhere else. The paraverse pervades our universe. Our universe is the set of entities that causally interact with one another in space and time. It is a spatial, temporal, entitative, causal continuum, a synergia. Only consciousness itself is clear and knowing. Everything else is derivative or is an expansion, therefore an identification of that apexal identity. In this session, just to recap, we're looking at identity and identification as, if you will, the essence and the existence that comes from that essence through the interaction and inseparability of consciousness and of being, of cognos and of ontos. And the way that it unfolds at each level of being leads to its various lives, from the sufficient life all the way up to where it experiences the bliss of the highest realms. Why does identity exist? Identity is its own reason or purpose for existence. In ancient cosmology, reality is described as Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat is being, Chit is consciousness, and Ananda is bliss. Consciousness and being, Sat and Chit, always united as the agent, which is always watching and acting at the very same moment. And that agency itself, as identity, is what is the ground, the source, for all its identifications in its interactions within the universe. That axis of identity is the very spine along which consciousness grows and fulfills its being in the various lives, from sufficient and secure all the way up through the friendly and the happy, These are the purposes that identity expresses itself as identification in order to have these fulfillments, these fruits. And so the who emerges through the whats and the whens and the whence and the whithers and the hows. It emerges and expresses through all of that in order to attain its complete actualization of what it potentially is. Now, will it complete its actualization at a final apokatastasis in which everything attains an ideal state? Well, that would seem to go against the very nature of infinite consciousness, would it not? So until the next time, behave when you must, be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.